thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm going to sort of talk to you. I want to talk a little bit about the social context of nano. So I'm going to go quickly through the technology and get you into a lot of the work we've done with the public in terms of national polls and focus groups and how people are starting to feel about this. So let's just do a little bit on the technology. This is my favorite definition of nanotech from Richard Smalley, who won the Nobel Prize for the development of carbon buckyballs, the art and science of building stuff that does stuff at a nanometer scale. It's kind of a fuzzy definition, but I think it's a very good one. So what the building stuff about nanotech, this is, I compare this to the photograph of the footprint on the moon. This said, we got there at a nanoscale. This was done by some people at IBM who spelled out their logo in xenon atoms. It took them about 22 hours to actually manipulate these individual atoms to spell out IBM. So at this point in time, we actually were able to reach down to an atomic scale and start manipulating stuff. Since then, we've come a long way. This is an example of Jim Tour's nano car. These are actual individual gold atoms. It's 3 to 4 nanometers across. It's got wheels. It's got axles. So to give you some sense of just the incredible amount of control that we've got at those scales. The secret here is when you get down to that scale, things do things differently. So if you take gold, I've got some gold fillings in my mouth. They tend to be relatively inert. Gold particles at 70 nanometers are highly reactive. So I've changed the properties completely. If I take gold down to 4 to 6 nanometers, I can change its color 3 times. So this ability at that scale to change the chemical properties, the optical properties, the conductivity, the way these substances interact with the environment, this is what gets people excited and also worried. Last year, $12.6 billion were invested in nanotech R&D globally by the public and private sector. The U.S. government invests $1.4 billion last year. That's twice as much money as we invested in the Human Genome Project at the height of the Genome Project. So this is a huge government investment. You can add almost $2 billion investment by industry in this country. The states are investing probably another $400 million a year in nanotech R&D. And then you've got the venture capitalists who, depending on how optimistic they are, have been pumping $300 to $400 million a year into nanotech in the U.S. alone. So there's an incredible amount of money, and obviously some of the promises are certainly newer materials, the ability to filter water, desalinate water. Certainly the energy applications will be immense, as well as food and medicine. The National Cancer Institute's investing about $145 million a year just in using nanotech to develop new cancer diagnostic techniques and therapies. So all of this is on the horizon. What I want to talk about a little bit is the reality. We've actually created an inventory of nanotechnology products that are on the market. These are all products that are identified by the manufacturer as containing nanotech. It's obviously an undercount because not everything appears on the web. How many of you have seen some of these? Okay. So tennis players, mountain bike frames, cosmetics, tennis balls. This is not sort of the cancer therapies. This is nanotech, the first generation. The golf balls, the things you slip in your shoe to insulate your foot, quite interesting. We actually buy a lot of this. We have a huge kind of storefront of nanotech products that people can take a look at. So this is sort of nanotech, the reality. And I put this up here because I think that there's a tendency in the nanotech world to sort of exaggerate quite often what's going on. I mean, this is if you haven't read this, it's a wonderful book by an English historian called The Shock of the Old. And basically, the message is we're surrounded by a lot of old technologies. Everyone keeps talking about the new stuff, but the reality is that we still rely on the internal combustion engine, steam power, basic chemical synthesis. All of these technologies were developed over a century ago. So this is kind of a reminder that as we sort of look forward, we need to also be thinking about how technologies are actually used by us on a daily basis. Another little comment by Richard Feynman about the need to focus on reality rather than always on promise or public relations. So let's go back and look at the products. One of the things is the number of products are increasing significantly. Some of the largest increases are in clothing and cosmetics, personal care products. We're seeing the beginning of nanotech applications in food and food packaging. And what we found in our inventory is the number of products have actually doubled in under 14 months. And there's also a shift in what kind of nano-engineered materials are being used. When we started the inventory, there was a lot of carbon, sort of nano-engineered carbon in products. Now it's shifted predominantly to silver. And a lot of the nano-engineered silver is used as antimicrobials. So I can buy nano-microbial or nano-treated socks, underwear, shirts. Now we have the nano teddy bear and the nano pacifier and the nano baby toothbrush. All of this is coming from China and Korea. I'll come back a little bit to this, why it's important to think about actually where these things come from. This is another inventory we've got online. So that the real hotspots are actually Boston and eastern Massachusetts and San Francisco or Silicon Valley. And if you want to have fun, you can actually go in here. We've got all the data ported into Google Maps, and you can drill down and actually see what's going on in your neighborhood. The other thing that's occurred is a lot of non-governmental organizations have become involved in nano. Up at the very top is the first sort of public protest that occurred at a nano facility. This was in Berkeley, outside of a DOE facility. And these folks, with their back towards you, is a group called FONG, Topless Humans Organized Against Genetic Manipulation, or something like that. Anyway, they showed up at a Eddie Bauer store protesting the use of nano in pants. But again, you could see here a lot of very high-powered environmental groups, including the Sierra Club, Greenpeace, NRDC, and in fact, the Friends of the Earth have actually submitted a petition to the Food and Drug Administration asking them to block or essentially put a moratorium on the sale of nano-based sunscreens. So one of the things that's happened is you've got this increased number of NGOs that are active and putting a lot of attention on what's going on with nano. Press coverage has grown. 3 or 4 years ago, you wanted to read about nano, you had to go into peer-reviewed journals. Now we got nano coverage in Cosmopolitan, Allure, Alternative Medicine, so it's getting into the press a lot more. And different types of press. Red Herring magazine is generally focused on the techies and investors in Silicon Valley. This was a cover, Nano No-No. We've done a bunch of spots for NPR and the Nightly Business Report, MSNBC, and the coverage is quite interesting. This is some work that's been done at Lehigh by Sharon Friedman. She just tracks how the risks are reported around nano in both the US and the UK. And you can see kind of what people are focusing on in terms of coverage of health risk, environmental risks, and regulation. A lot more in the UK on do we need to regulate nano. Why are people worried? I'm not going to spend a lot of time on the toxicology, but the basic worry is something that toxicologists call translocation. It's important to realize that when you're down at that scale, you're designing things at a biological scale. So a red blood cell is 7,000 nanometers in diameter. A strand of DNA is about 2 nanometers across. So you're basically creating things that can act very, very intimately with the body. And that, in some cases, is good news. I mean, that's why the medical profession is very, very excited about this. But it also has a lot of people worried in terms of the ability of these particles to go places in the body that other particles simply could not go. So there's worry about sunscreens and whether there's dermal penetration. There's some studies that have occurred, at least in animals, where the particles have gone into the olfactory lobe and into the brain. That's actually got a lot of people excited who want to deliver drugs to the brain because this might be a way of getting drugs basically into the brain in a fairly non-invasive way and a very targeted way. Just to give you an idea, this over here, right up there is the air exchange membrane in your lung. That's 1,000 nanometers across. That's one of the thinnest tissues in the human body. One other thing, obviously, that has people worried is this going to look anything like asbestos? And certainly you can create particles that will mimic asbestos. These are just 3 forms of zinc oxide out of about 24 forms that have been created at Georgia Tech. Same chemical, okay? 24 different structural forms. So one can imagine that each one of these structural forms may have very different properties once it's in the body. So there's some real issues about exactly the way these things look structurally can have huge impacts on the environment, on human health. And obviously, if I can produce 100 different structural variations of one chemical, that gives people a lot to think about and a lot to study. Some of the other things that are worry people about, there's been some research on increased inflammatory response, immune suppression, and then there's the issue of will certain people be more susceptible. People have identified a gene, for instance, in the body that if you have this particular gene, you're far more susceptible to beryllium exposure. And your chance of getting lung cancer is 20 times greater than somebody without this gene. Now, luckily, not many people are exposed to beryllium, but as we learn more about the genetic makeup of human beings, the questions will become apparent. Are there certain subpopulations that might be more susceptible? And this raises issues around, obviously, environmental justice, who's exposed, who's not.